Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the 2020 edition of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present our very own Dr. Caleb Brown. Caleb is the curator of dinosaur systematics and evolution here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Caleb is originally from northern British Columbia, but he grew up in Red Deer, Alberta. He received his bachelor's degree in zoology from the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary, and during that time spent 3 summers during his undergrad years working in the prep lab here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. After completing his bachelor's degree, Caleb stayed at the U of C to pursue a master's degree, again in the Department of Biological Sciences, where he investigated the diversity of small plant-eating dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous of Canada. After successfully defending his thesis, Caleb moved to Ontario to pursue his PhD in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. For his dissertation, he studied the variation and evolutionary morphology in horned dinosaurs from Dinosaur Provincial Park. Fresh out of his PhD, Caleb moved to Drumheller to hold the Betsy Nichols postdoctoral fellowship at the museum and joined the ranks of the curators last year. Caleb's research interests focus primarily on the evolution of dinosaurs, particularly ceratopsians. Over the years, Caleb has conducted fieldwork in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, China, and Mongolia. Today, Caleb will talk about the evidence for aggression among tyrannosaurs. So, without further delay, I present you Dr. Caleb Brown.
Thanks, Oscar. Thank you all for being here to come see this talk about Tyrannosaur scars and aggression. If you know me, this is a bit out of my normal topic. I normally work on horned dinosaurs or other plant-eating dinosaurs. So this is a bit of a new research topic for me. It's also not published and not fully complete. So I want to show you kind of the preliminary results and get some feedback at that stage. And this project started about 2 years ago. And what happened was this specimen was found as part of our fieldwork program at Dinosaur Park in 2017. This is found by Ian McDonald, one of our preparation team. It doesn't look like much in the ground, but it was collected and prepared by Aaron Kilmer, another one of our preparators. And when it's prepared, we got a nearly complete Tyrannosaur maxilla. So the maxilla is the upper jaw here of a Tyrannosaur. And that's great, it's a nice complete bone, but the really interesting thing about it is it has this very interesting crescentic mark running all the way across the surface there. You can see that highlighted. And if we play with the lighting a bit, make it a bit more high angle light, you can see there's actually several of these marks. There's another one there, there's another one there. What these marks represent is scars, so damage to the bone, and as a result the bone has healed and it has these kind of raised elongate ridges. And this is very exciting as a paleontologist because normally when we have bones, we just have aspects of their anatomy and what they look like in death. It doesn't necessarily preserve behavior. Things like footprints preserve behavior and things like bite marks and interactions preserve behavior. And that's exactly what these things are. These are bite marks that have healed, and they're bite marks from another tyrannosaur. So it indicates that this animal got into a fight with another animal and it survived the fight long enough for those marks to heal up. Just to kind of show you in a bit more detail what these look like if we map them out, and you'll see these diagrams kind of throughout the talk, just a simple line drawing highlighting in orange or red where these scars occur. And this really got me wondering, because this is a pretty extreme example of bite marks, and I was curious how this compares to other Tyrannosaur specimens that have bite marks. This has been noted before in the literature, and that really got the ball rolling for this project. This is just to remind me that this particular specimen is out in the gallery if you want to see it after the talk. It's in the Fossils in Focus exhibit, and you can see the bite marks running across the bone there. And I mentioned that bite marks are published in the literature. There has been some work. The first and the most thorough paper on this subject is one by Tanky and Curry in 1999. And they looked at 13 specimens, they did a bit of a survey. They found healed or healing bite marks in 5 of those specimens, including one that had an embedded tooth in it. So we know it was a Tyrannosaur that was doing the biting. And they discussed the possible behavioral implications for these bite marks. And this is a great image by Michael Skrepnik that shows kind of this animal healing up after getting into a fight. There's a couple more papers that followed. About 10 years later, Bell and Curry described that embedded tooth and confirmed that this was Tyrannosaur on Tyrannosaur fighting. In the same year, another paper by Peterson described another specimen that had multiple bite marks on it. In this case, it was a subadult Tyrannosaur, or Tyrannosaurus. And then just a couple years ago, another paper looking at, again, another single specimen with multiple bite marks. This time it had a mixture of bite marks that had healed, but also bite marks that had no healing, that were probably post-mortem. So it might have all been fighting, but also probably some carnivory as well. There are some differences between these papers and what they suggest, but there are some commonalities. And the main conclusions are that all of these marks are the result of healed or healing bite marks from other tyrannosaurs, and that this was some form of interspecific aggression or face-biting behavior, so animals of the same species fighting each other. But there were some limitations to most of these studies that had been done before. First off, although it had the best data set, there's actually very few figures and measurements in the original paper. And then all of the subsequent papers concentrated on one single specimen, so really small sample sizes. And they all largely concentrated on articulated or associated skulls, which is great, but that only represents a very small amount of our fossil record of tyrannosaurs. We have a lot more individual isolated elements like the one I showed you at the beginning than articulated or associated skulls. So really we're just looking at a very small amount of the data set that's available. So I started looking through the collections and getting an idea for how common these bite marks were, what's the pattern for their occurrences, and I started noticing interesting patterns. That's basically what I'm going to present to you today. So I started this survey of Tyrannosaur cranial elements. This is a bit out of date, but as of a couple weeks ago, it was 180 specimens. That includes 35 skulls. Not all of those are complete. Some of those are partial skulls, some of those are complete, some are disarticulated, and about 145 isolated elements. So in total is about 550 individual bones. So quite a good data set for looking at bite marks in tyrannosaurs. We can look at the distribution of where these come from, and almost 3/4 of them are here at the Tyrrell Museum. And the reason I put this up is because this really highlights how important ongoing collection in places like Dinosaur Provincial Park are. We have a great data set, but if you really want to look at population level patterns like this, you have to keep collecting, keep building up that data set. And that's why we have 3/4 of all the tyrannosaur bones that I looked at here. About 10% at the Canadian Museum of Nature and the the University of Alberta, and about 5% at the ROM. And I was able to do a collections trip about a year ago looking at all these specimens. So in total, I've pretty much seen all of the late Cretaceous tyrannosaur material from Canada, with a couple of exceptions at the Field Museum and the Smithsonian and the American Museum. And just to show you what these things look like when we zoom in, so I'm going to show you the specimen number here. This just shows which bone it is. In this case, it's the dentary or the lower jaw. Here's your line drawing that shows the outline of the bone, and then photograph showing what the bite mark looks like. So in this case, you can see there's 2 bite marks. In the top, I just have arrows pointing to them. In the bottom, I've actually outlined them in red, so you can see the extent and the shape of these things. In this case, it's this incised, elongate mark. There's 2 of them. Not a lot of healing yet. It's still pretty rugged and rough around the edge. Here's another example. This is another dentary of a tyrannosaur. This is on the ventral, so right on the underside, kind of the chin area of the jaw. And up top again, you can see here's those 2 bite marks. And in this case, they have this kind of central incised original area that was bitten. And then the bone around it has kind of become porous and swelled up a bit, it kind of puckered. And that's basically the bone reacting to this injury and healing. And you can see that's shown in the orange in the bottom image. And I'm going to keep that color convention throughout the talk. So the red is kind of fresh areas that are incised, and the orange is kind of these healed, puckered, porous areas. Here's another specimen, and you can see there's a variety of different marks on here. Some of these are quite nasty. Again, this is on the underside of the jaw. This is a lateral view, so view from the outside. Here's that same bone from the inside. So this is up where the tongue would be on the inside of the jaw. And there are big bite marks in here that are healing. So some of these are really quite nasty injuries. Here's a great example, another dentary of a very large individual. In this case, you can see there's kind of 4 that are all lined up. They're parallel, they're equally spaced. There's probably 4 teeth that hit at the same time. This one's nicely incised there. These ones are healing up or healed. And then at the back of the jaw, there's these much more subtle ones as well that are probably healed up, much older marks. There's the kind of that interpretive overlay of those individual marks. Another one from the inside of the jaw. You can see how it's all swollen up here around that original incised area. We also get them on the maxilla as well, the upper jaw. This is actually quite a small individual. I'm just looking at the front of the snout here. And you can see there's 3 parallel marks here. Again, 3 probably serial teeth that bit at the same time. And this is one of my favorite ones. It's a really good example of late stage healing. So if you run your finger across it, it's quite smooth. You couldn't even tell it's there. But if you look at the texture of the bone, you can see it's all reworked and it's all remodeled due to the healing process. And you might have seen this guy in the news a couple of weeks ago. There was a new Tyrannosaur announced, Thanatothrystes digrutorum. And the holotype specimen has a beautiful bite mark running along the maxilla. In fact, when I looked at a lot of the type material on my trip out east to the Canadian Museum of Nature, you could see healed bite marks on the holotypes of Gorgosaurus, on the second specimen, the kind of unofficial paratype of Albertosaurus, the holotype of Daspletosaurus, and on this specimen as well. So pretty much all of the type material has bite marks on it, so they're quite common. Just to kind of summarize the stepwise healing of these bites, showing some examples. Again, you have these really incised, deep things that start to swell up around the edges, a lot of swelling associated with healing, and then presumably older marks, much more healed. They're smooth or they're raised, but they don't have that same incised area or the same puckered and porous morphology. And what this probably represents is a healing gradient. So fresh marks look like this, and then if the animal survives long enough to heal up, it kind of develops this kind of puckered and porous appearance, and eventually it looks kind of like this. And this means 2 important things. First off, it means that the animals survived long enough to heal, which is important. This didn't kill the animals. This wasn't delivered after the animals died. And secondly, it gives us a very coarse metric for how old the individual marks were. Obviously, this mark here would be older than that mark there, so we can actually line some of these things up. And this convention going from red to an orangey color, so red being fresh, orange being healed, I'm going to keep throughout the talk as well. So what is the data that I'm collecting when I'm looking at these specimens? So I'm doing a survey, and it breaks down into 2 kind of types of data. The first data is data on the element itself. Which bone is it? Is it the maxilla, the upper jaw, dentary lower jaw? Is it a frontal or something like that? Which side does it come from? Is it the left or right side? Which species, which formation it comes from? And then some metric of size. How big is that element? Is it from a baby? Is it from a juvenile, subadult, adult? I'll talk a bit more about this later on. And then in addition to that, collecting data on presence or absence of scars. So the first question is just occurrence. Presence, absence, do they occur? If it's a no, then I'm done with that specimen. That's easy. If it's a yes, then it's how many bite marks are there? What are their size? What are their orientation? And then this metric of, are they kind of fresh or are they healed? And then for each one of those, photographing and drawing, as you've seen on those kind of outlines, where that scar occurs. And that's really important because some of these are quite subjective in terms of, are they a bite mark or are they something else? So if I can publish a photo and says, this is what I'm interpreting as a bite mark, somebody else can come up after the fact and say, I agree with him or I don't agree with him, but they're very clear about what we're talking about. So it's just being very clear and transparent about what the interpretation of a bite mark is in this case. And we can set up a whole bunch of hypotheses to test with that data set. And the way we do this is we set up a null hypothesis. Basically, the null hypothesis is that there's nothing interesting going on. There's no strong correlations. There's nothing out of ordinary. And then if that's the case, if that's not the case, you come up with an alternate hypothesis that explains the data. So the null hypothesis are things like the position of these across the skeleton is random. There's no pattern. The orientation is random. There's no distinct distribution between the left or right side of the body. The occurrence is independent of the size of the animal. The healing is independent of the size of the animal. And if we know the size of the biter and the bitee, the perpetrator and the victim, are they similar size or not? So these are kind of what we're going to test here. First off, let's look at the position and the orientation of these scars. Here is the data set. So these are different bones of the skull. Some of them you recognize. The important ones are the dentary is the lower jaw, and the maxilla here is the upper jaw. The sample includes a wide variety of Tyrannosaur taxa, pretty much all of them that we have here. Good data sets for things like Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus, and smaller data sets for the other ones. I'm really only showing you data for the first 5 taxa here. My sample for Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus is quite small, and they're quite a bit larger, so it kind of throws off some of the size aspects as well. So in terms of occurrence, are there bite marks occurring on these elements? This column is number of specimens that have bite marks, and the second column is the percentage. And the take-home message here is that they're quite common in some of the elements. Things like the dentary, right there, the maxilla, they're both about 50%. Of the specimens have bite marks, which is quite high. Most of the other elements are quite lower. So already you're seeing a pattern that it's not random or it's not uniform. There is kind of areas where bite marks are more common. This can be shown with a heat map. So basically here's a skull, all the bones are a different color, and that color corresponds to the percentage of bite marks. So from 0 to 100. And you can see the darker the bone, the more bite marks there are, the higher proportion of bones that have bite marks. And most of the action is happening kind of on the snout. It's happening on the maxilla, the upper jaw, and the dentary, the lower jaw. We can also look at number of bite marks on those elements when there are bite marks. So this is the count. And you can see for those 2 elements that are the most important, the dentary and the maxilla, when they have bite marks, they have quite a few. They average about 3, which is surprising. It's not just 1 bite mark here or there. When they occur, they're quite common. In total, I've documented almost 300 bite marks across various Tyrannosaur specimens. So again, quite a good data set for looking at things like frequency. These are what some of the bite marks look like. Here's just a very small selection of the maxillae, the upper jaws. This is the one I showed you at the beginning. And some of these show similar patterns. There's these really long arcing scars that kind of are almost at a 45-degree angle. They're on kind of the same spot on the side of the maxilla. And then there's also marks that, so back over, these are called type 2 marks, these very elongate type lineations. There's also things that are more like punctures. They're basically circular or slightly oval, like this one here or that one there, the ones down here. If you see where those occur, those tend to occur on the top of the element here. They tend to occur on this ridge here or where it abuts the nasal. Whereas these long linear things, they occur on the side of the element or on the side of the face. Here's again a very small selection of lower jaws. You've seen some of these already, just noting where these things occur. And you see the same pattern here. The deep circular ones tend to be at the bottom of the jaw, and the elongate ones tend to be on the side of the element. And it's not just isolated elements as well. We have skulls. This is a good sample of Tyrannosaur skulls that do have bite marks. I didn't show the ones that don't have bite marks. And you can see a similar pattern. Here's, again, 45-degree angle on the maxilla. Interesting patterns happening for some of these ones. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all of that data set, all of those skulls, and we are going to basically make a composite. So here's basically a blank general skull. Here's that first specimen I showed you, and I'm just overlaying those bite marks onto that one skull. Okay. Here's another specimen. I'm throwing that on there as well. Another one throwing that on there as well. And we're just going to see if we pile all these up, what's the end result. And this is the end result when we have 59 specimens, almost 300 bite marks. It's a pretty interesting pattern. First off, remember we have these type 1 and type 2, these basically round or kind of slightly oval marks and these elongate things. On the upper jaw, or on the upper part, on the skull itself, not the lower jaw, those type 1 marks with these orange stars tend to be on the nasal region or on this ridge on the maxilla here, the areas that point upwards. Whereas those type 2 marks tend to be on the side of the maxilla, the side of the face, and they all kind of have a very similar orientation. They're all about 45 degrees. On the lower jaw, it's similar but opposite. Those deep circular things tend to be on the bottom of the lower jaw here, and the lineations tend to be on the outside of the jaw most often, but sometimes actually on the inside of the jaw. So the ones shown in this pinkish hue down here, those are actually on the inside of the jaw. So quite common for that to happen as well. The other thing to notice is that not only are they consistent in terms of where they occur and the orientation, but they're kind of restricted to kind of the first third of the skull here. They're all on the snout. There are bite marks back here, but nowhere near as dense as this front part of the skull. So if we go back to our hypotheses, our first two hypotheses about the position being random and the orientation being random, we can reject those. There's definitely consistent patterns here. There's a consistency and a repeatedness to where they occur, and there's a consistency and a repeatedness to their orientation. Just to show you kind of in my mind, the best explanation for how these bite marks occur, there's these models. So we're looking from the top. We have this blue Tyrannosaur and this gray one, and I think they're kind of sizing each other up, look side to side, and then kind of side-swiping, trying to grab the other's skull, because you have the bite mark coming down from the top on the maxilla, coming from the bottom on the dentary. Here's a view from the side. You have these two animals, and you're either trying to capture the other animal skull like that, or possibly like that. Who knows? This is just a very hand-wavy thing of the most likely way that these injuries are happening. Jim Gardner actually suggested I come up with sock puppets and illustrate this, but I decided this would be a bit better way to do it. So, let's see. So the next question we're asking is about, we have all this data on bite marks and their occurrence. We can also look at left and right. You might think, why is that important? Well, handedness or lateralization is actually quite common for vertebrates. It's this thing you see happening all the time. You see it in across many vertebrates, and you especially see it in very practiced or ritualized behaviors. Things like tool use in crows, things like parrots picking up certain food items with a preferential hand. So if this behavior is kind of this very ritualized and practiced behavior, maybe it has a certain left or right bias. That would be very interesting. So here's data on frequency for the left side of the body versus the right side of the body for all those different elements. There's a bit of a weird thing happening with the jugal, but outside of the jugal, the numbers are pretty much the same. You don't see a systematic bias towards the left or the right being more common. And if you do the same thing with the number of bites, you see the same pattern. This is just a statistical test, a chi-square test. None of these are significant. And that means either two things. Either they're not having a bias left or right, or more likely, my sample size is just too small to actually distinguish if there is a systemic difference left or right. So for that, you need quite a big data set. But I thought I'd run the numbers anyway and see what I got. Just to kind of plot this up as a graph. So here's the different bones of the skull along the x-axis, the frequency of the bite marks, and on the left is blue, and right on the right is orange. And you can see generally the results are very similar. They're equal, except for the jugal here, which is a weird outlier. So if we go back to our null hypothesis, in this case, we can't disprove that null hypothesis. It looks like they are equal, at least given our current data set. So now we come to the question of size. How does all this relate to size? And to do this, we need to figure out how big the individual elements are. And that's a bit more problematic, because if you have complete skulls or complete bones, you can measure them. Here we have a big, large adult dentary. Here we have a subadult dentary. And we can do things like measure the tooth row length and compare those and see how big one is relative to the other. But what do you do for partial elements? My data set wants to use as many specimens as possible to get a good statistical power. So I want to make use of this. And I know that this specimen is smaller than that one. It's about the same size as this one. What we can actually do is measure all those alveoli, the tooth sockets. And we can see if the alveoli size, or at least the mean alveoli size for the element, correlates with tooth row length. And if it does, we can use elements that just have a couple of alveoli preserved to estimate the size of the bone. It turns out that they correlate quite well. Here's the maxilla in red, the dentary in blue. Very strong correlation between average or mean alveolar size and the tooth row length of the element. So if we just have incomplete elements, we can at least estimate their size. And I did a back calculation. We're about 5% error when we back calculate some of these things. So pretty good for what we're looking at. So again, for a partial specimen, we can just measure up these individual averages and regress that on the plot and come up with an estimate of how big the animal was, or how big the element was. So what I'm going to show you here is on the x-axis, we have tooth row length. This is a log scale. So here's the actual numbers in the bottom if that helps you think about it. The number of tooth marks on the y-axis. So each dot is going to be an individual specimen, and it's going to be the number of tooth marks on that specimen given its size. And I'm going to plot up the dentary in blue and the maxilla in red separately. So here's the data for the small animals, getting up to about 230 millimeters tooth row length, and there's no bite marks, consistently none, across both the dentary and the maxilla in the data set. above this threshold, we see bite marks start happening. And they're fairly consistent. Some are quite numerous in terms of the amount of bite marks. But the other thing to keep in mind is that all the way through this size series, even to the very largest ones, there's still animals that have no bite marks. It's not that you go from no bite marks to everything has bite marks. You have no bite marks to there's a whole mess of data. Some of it has bite marks, some of it has none. Rather than looking at the number of tooth marks per element, what we can actually do is bin this x-axis into sections and look at the proportion of the individuals in each section that has bite marks. And that's what I'm doing here. So again, dentary in blue, maxilla in red, the combined is in black. So each dot here represents the mean or the average for that bin in terms of the proportion that have bite marks. So again, no bite marks, and all of a sudden bite marks start. And they are fairly consistent. They're about 65% of the specimens have bite marks. And then it drops off at the end here. Don't worry too much about this. This is a bit of an edge effect, getting kind of near the end of the data, so don't put too much weight on that data point there. But we see this pattern where there's no bite marks, all of a sudden they start, and they're kind of fairly consistent there. And I've just removed the dentary and the maxilla data. We're just looking at the combined data set now. Remember when we looked at how old the scars were, whether they were fresh or whether they were healed? We can superimpose that data onto this data. What happens is that all of the bite marks initially are the fresh ones, or the red ones. And we don't see any old bite marks there. And then as the animals get bigger, we see the proportion of old bite marks gets larger and larger. This is the absolute count here. This is the proportion. You can see again, they're all fresh, and then it slowly decreases as the animals get bigger to a higher and higher proportion of them being old. This makes sense. This makes exact sense. If this is where the bite marks are starting to happen, that's exactly the pattern that you would expect to find. So if we go back to our hypotheses, we're looking at occurrence and healing. Are those independent with size? And in fact, they're not. We can reject that. They're both positively correlated with size. We get more bite marks when the animals get bigger, and the fresh bite marks are correlated with the small animals, and the old bite marks are correlated with the larger animals. So now we can look at this interesting thing of the size of the bitee and the size of the biter. And I didn't think I'd be able to look at this, but it turns out it actually works quite well. So here's a bunch of examples of what we call serial occurrences of bite marks. So these 4 bite marks here, they're all parallel. They're all about equally spaced. So it makes sense that these were caused by a single bite with multiple teeth hitting the element at once. Same thing down here, same thing here. Sometimes we have a missing bite mark, but these animals had missing teeth. They constantly shed their teeth. So the fact that we have missing ones occasionally isn't too much of a problem. Now, what was our size metric for these animals? Was alveolar spacing, the distance between the teeth. What does this represent? That represents alveolar spacing. So we can actually directly compare the measurements here to the measurements here and look at, on an individual specimen, how big was the perpetrator, how big was the aggressor, and how big was the victim. And they're actually quite strongly correlated. They're highly significant. The R-squared value is not super high, so we only have about 40% predictive power, but strong correlation nonetheless. And it's isometric, which means that they scale equally. Big animals were biting big animals, small animals were biting small animals. So that blue line there just shows isometry plus or minus 10%, and most of the data falls within that, which I think is quite exciting. So we've gone through all of our hypotheses, we've kind of rejected some of the nulls, and we have some interesting patterns here in terms of the alternate hypotheses. I also want to talk about how distributed these patterns are throughout the Tyrannosaur family. So this is a phylogeny of Tyrannosauridae from the recent paper on Thyranothrustus. The red taxa here that are highlighted, those are ones that have bite marks that I've documented. It's fairly consistent throughout the tree. Most of these other animals are known from very scrappy bits, and we don't have a good sample size. So the fact that they don't have bite marks doesn't mean that they don't have bite marks, it just means we haven't found them yet. So it's likely that this behavior was ancestral to Tyrannosaurs. It didn't evolve independently in all these groups. It was something that that whole clade had. And if we zoom out a bit, so here's Tyrannosauridae now, this puts it into the theropod phylogeny. There's a lot of other theropods that show the same behavior. This is an allosaur specimen from the Jurassic of Utah that has bite marks, very similar to Tyrannosaur bite marks. It's already been noted in Cineraptor. There's a Spinosaur specimen that has bite marks. So maybe this is actually a very common behavior in theropods in general. And you really only see it in the fossil record when you get big animals that are big enough to cause injury to the bone. the small animals might not actually be damaging the bone, whereas big things like Tyrannosaurs and Spinosaurs and allosaurs could do that. So it's an interesting thing to consider there, and that's another aspect of the research. So I've talked about the fossils, and I can talk about fossils all day, and she's not eating it, she's taking it to the water, so she's being a good mom, don't worry. But we can only say so much about fossils. We have to put it in a comparative context. We have to look at living animals and compare these patterns to what we see in living animals. And often a good analog, a good model for looking at dinosaurs are crocodilians. They're closely related. They have big teeth, so it's a decent comparison. So when I was at the Royal Ontario Museum looking at the Tyrannosaurs, I also looked at their collection of alligator mississippiensis. They have a good data set that's unique because it's largely wild-caught specimens, and they have associated data like age, sex, weight, size. Oh, sorry, got those in the wrong order. And these you don't have in the fossil record, and you can plot the patterns of bite marks that correlate with these things, and then infer from that back onto our Tyrannosaur pattern. So here's just a subsample of the stuff I saw at the ROM in terms of their alligator data set. We have tiny things that'll fit in the palm of your hand, little hatchlings, all the way up to giant alligators. And again, I've highlighted the skulls with these red showing the bite marks. I'm just going to highlight a few important specimens. This is one of the bigger ones. Does that look familiar? I'd say it looks pretty much exactly the same as what we're seeing on these Tyrannosaurs, including a healed bite mark there, or healing bite mark there. We also have ones where you actually can see the crescentic arc of the teeth that made contact. And we can kind of superimpose in gray here where the animal was actually coming in and making that bite mark, which I think is quite cool, quite impressive. So it's hard to say that that's not a bite mark from another alligator. It fits very nicely. And then we have extreme examples. This is one that the snout, the entire premaxilla was bitten off, and the animal healed up, lived long enough to heal. And I thought this was extreme and kind of was surprised by what I saw. But this is quite common. Crocodilians can be quite nasty when they get into fights with each other. And I have a content warning. I'm going to show you some pictures in the next slide, just showing injuries that crocodilians have caused to other crocodilians. And some of them are quite nasty. So there you go. This is what these things do to each other when they're fighting for territory or fighting for mates. These animals are all still alive. Many of them have survived long enough to heal. And if they died and became a fossil, that healing would be recorded on the bone. They're obviously not very happy individuals. They are surviving for a certain period of time. I don't know if they're going to survive forever. This guy's been around for a long time. He's quite a celebrity. Yeah, so quite extreme. So let's go to our alligator data set, and let's do the same thing. Number of tooth marks here, and this is skull length, okay? And you see the same pattern. You see no bite marks up until a certain threshold here, and all of a sudden you see bite marks skyrocket, but you also see things that don't have bite marks all the way up to the size series. And again, just superimposing those examples of what these bite marks look like on alligator. And there's a threshold right about there, right about 1.8 meters snout bent length when the bite marks start. Does anyone know what happens at about 1.8 meters snout bent length with alligator? They become mature, yes. That is sexual maturity in alligators. It's not based on age, it's actually based on size. Alligators in North Carolina take longer to mature in terms of time, but they reach sexual maturity at the same body size approximately as the ones down in Florida. And we know this really well because these things are commercially harvested for meat and for leather. So it's really important to know when your things are becoming mature. So that's a very interesting pattern there. We can also look at other analogs. This is an Australian water dragon. We see the same thing here. No bite marks, and all of a sudden they skyrocket here. And again, sexual maturity in this animal largely correlates with where the bite marks start. So an interesting pattern with modern animals. So let's see what these animals are actually doing. This is just going to play a video of these two lizards fighting for territory or mates or resources or something. Just watch what they're doing. Lots of posturing, sizing each other up. You can actually see he has a wound on his premaxilla there. This one has a wound there as well. So lots of posturing, lots of bluffing, lots of sizing each other up. Here's another example. It's mainly posturing. It's mainly sizing each other up, and then they do occasionally come to blows and try to. You can see his dewlap flaring there. This guy's going to get it in a moment. So, but he does run away in the end. He's fine. It just looks a bit drastic. So he's okay. He survives. What I think this pattern is potentially related to this threshold where the bite marks start might be sexual maturity in Tyrannosaurs. At least it's an interesting hypothesis to test. Not necessarily that we have conclusive data, but it's something to consider. It fits the data very nicely. It fits the extant analogs quite well. So let's go back and revisit some of those interpretations, some of those observations first off. These bite marks, they're very frequent, and they're very consistent in terms of their position and their orientation. They're restricted to animals that are 45% adult size or more, about half grown. The fresh marks occur on the ones that are just small enough to be biting, and the old marks are largely restricted to the older, larger animals. And there's a strong correlation between the size of the biter and the size of the bitee. So all of these are consistent with this idea that this represents some sort of sociosexual agonistic interaction. That just means that it's animals of the same species fighting for some reason that is driven either by sexual selection or social interactions within the species. The fact that we get these restricted to larger animals, and that's also backed up by the occurrence of the pattern of healing, suggests that this onset may be related to some threshold in terms of their life history. And the most obvious thing to consider is sexual maturity. The correlation between the biter and the biting means that only animals of comparative size are engaging in this behavior. So, which means two possible things. Either if there's a very unfit match in terms of a very large individual, very small individual, the small guy is going to run away. Or when they do engage in combat, the small one just gets eaten and may not enter the fossil record. You can't really distinguish between those from the data set available. Now, there's one other observation that is interesting and worth considering, and that's that about 50% of the elements, the maxilla, the dentary, the skulls, have bite marks. This is about 65% if you consider the kind of adult ones, the ones above that threshold. That's really interesting, and that's consistent in that larger part of the size threshold. So maybe this might represent a sexual difference. It might represent male-male combat. When we talk about social-sexual interactions, those are largely males fighting with males over resources, whether those resources be food or territory or females. So maybe this is males, and the ones that aren't having bite marks are the females. It's a hypothesis, but there's some data that might not suggest that's a great hypothesis, or at least not that we can't conclude that for sure. First off, it's really hard to determine sex in the fossil record from things like dinosaurs. We just have the skeletons largely. The skeletons don't preserve obvious primary or secondary sexual characters. There are weird exceptions. We do occasionally have dinosaurs that have eggs fossilized within them. So in that case, you know that it's a female. But those are very rare. And you occasionally have tissues that are called a medullary bone, which is found inside the long bones of the animal. And those are found in females just before she lays her eggs. And it's indicated that that animal is female. The lack of medullary bone doesn't mean anything. Just the presence is useful. But there are problems with that as well. It's destructive, and there are some pathologies, some diseases that look like medullary bone as well. So it's not a cut, dry, or easy-to-use technique. So we really don't know which sex is which in the fossil record. So it's hard to actually prove that or test that hypothesis. The other problem is that sometimes it really holds up with the extant analogs, and sometimes it doesn't. So here we have all those dots I showed you, just black. I didn't mention which sexes were which. We can throw on the sexes. In this case, the males are blue, the females are orange. Black are kind of indeterminate or juvenile. It works quite well for the water dragon. You can see almost all of the things that have bite marks are blue. There's a few females with 1 or 2 bite marks, but the ones that have large bite marks are always male, and there's very few ones that don't. But it doesn't hold up very well for our alligator data set. Most of the ones, at least in terms of my sample that I got, that have bite marks are female. So it's hard to know, are Tyrannosaurs like the alligator, or Tyrannosaurs like the water dragon? We don't know. The other problem is that, a continuation of the same problem, sorry, we can do a literature survey. So here, I haven't shown you the data yet, but I'm going to throw it on there in a few minutes. Delved into the literature and looked at the frequency of bite marks in a whole bunch of living animals, where they've divided up by males on the x-axis here and females on the y-axis. And this is often done in ecology studies or in biology studies because the frequency of bite marks is actually a really good indicator of aggression, as we've talked about, but also varies with population density. It varies between different subspecies as well. So it's actually a very useful tool for determining social interactions and making ecological inferences and behavioral inferences. So there's a huge data set, but no one's actually really pulled it together. So this is what I've done here. So here's 40 lizards. Again, this is the male frequency. So down here, no males and no females have bite marks. At this hypothetical endpoint here, 100% of the males have bite marks and none of the females have bite marks. And at this endpoint here, all the males and all the females have bite marks. Okay? That's 40 different lizards. The size of the dot is the sample size. Here's 58 mammals. Here's 11 amphibians, crocodilians, and turtles. So basically sampling the entire kind of amniote tetrapod radiation there. And there's 2 patterns that jump out, that I think jump out. The first one is that almost all of the data falls below this line in this kind of gray triangle. That means that across all the samples, bites are always more common in males, with like 3 or 4 exceptions. One exception that's actually statistically significant. Males get into fights more often and are injured more often than females. It happens with humans as well. But the other take-home message is that there's very few data that are right on this x-axis, and that axis is 100% of the males have bite marks and 0% of the females have bite marks. So what that means is that it's a mixture, it's biology, it's messy, it's not a perfect one-to-one correlation. So if we know that our bite mark frequency in Tyrannosaurs is about 50%, they probably fall along in here somewhere. We don't know if it's all the males doing the fighting and the females doing nothing, or if it's mixed. But it's kind of somewhere in that region. But it's a start in terms of how we can compare these 2 living animals. I'm just going to summarize this with a bit of kind of a what we know, or at least what we think we know about these bite marks based on the data set. First off is that Tyrannosaurs did engage in interspecific face biting behavior. And this was intense enough to leave bite marks on the bones themselves, but they often survived this behavior and healed up. This is very common. About 50% of all the skulls and 50% of the tooth-bearing elements have bite marks. It's consistent and repeated in terms of its position and orientation. And this suggests that there's some sort of posturing or ritualistic behavior in terms of how they're engaging in that biting. It's restricted to animals that are half-grown or larger. And it's restricted to animals of comparable size. And all of this, the best hypothesis to explain it is that this is correlated with sociosexual maturity and interspecific aggression associated with that. What we don't know are things like, what are they fighting for? Are they fighting for mates? Are they fighting for territory? Are they fighting for resources? Are they fighting for their hierarchy within a social structure of a group? We don't know. The other thing we don't know is what's happening in terms of, are these males or females? Is this all being driven by the males? Is it both sexes? If it's all being driven by the males and we can somehow prove that, or somehow reliably show that with histology or other methods, it actually makes a great indicator of sex, which is quite useful to understanding the social structure of these animals if we can do that. I'm not sure we can do that. We're also not sure how it relates to the sociality of these animals. There's ideas about them living in groups or living in solitary. We don't really know how these bite marks inform yet about group behavior or solitary behavior with these interactions. So there's quite a few areas of further research, but I think it's kind of an interesting question, interesting foundation to build upon. I don't want to end on Tyrannosaurs because it's not all about Tyrannosaurs. We do see very similar things in other aspects of our fossil record. So here's a great specimen of a mosasaur. Again, this is in the gallery. You can go see this after the talk. This is in the Grounds for Discovery exhibit. It's a mosasaur. There's a bite mark. There's actually an embedded tooth with healing around it from another mosasaur. So the mosasaur was biting another mosasaur. We have mosasaurs with bite marks from other mosasaurs as well. This particular one is work being done by Takuya, thank you. His name momentarily slipped my mind. We also have, on the much smaller scale, this is a image supplied by Jim Gardner. These are lower jaws dentaries of albinorpitontid amphibians. This is a normal dentary, and then these two dentaries are broken, fractured, and healed, but misaligned when they healed. And a good analog for albinorpidontids is things called plethodontid salamanders that live today. And they engage in this behavior where they kind of bite each other's heads or jaws and try to throw the other one around. And it often causes injuries in plethodontids. They were some of the examples on that plot I showed you earlier. So again, we have behaviors, injuries that are healed that likely correlate with social interactions of these animals. So it's at the big scale looking at tyrannosaurs, but all the way down to amphibians. I think amphibians are a good place to end, not on tyrannosaurs, but I'll leave that for you, Jim. So, bunch of people to thank. Thank you for the Cooperating Society for inviting me to give a talk here, and everyone who has helped feedback and preparation of specimens and access.